Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the second annual Cornell Historic Preservation Planning Alumni Virtual Symposium. My name is Michelle Anderson. I graduated from the Historic Preservation Planning program in 2018, and I've had the pleasure to serve as chair of the HPPA Symposium Planning Committee this spring. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the purpose of this event is to highlight the work of HPP alumni and current students, and to serve as a platform for us to reconnect and share ideas. This year's symposium includes 3 tracks. Up first this morning is The Next Generation, which will showcase the work of current students and recent alumni, class of 2019 to present. Later this afternoon, Preservation Education will focus on the current state and future outlook of preservation education and coursework priorities. Tomorrow, Old Buildings, New Perspectives will feature projects and presentations from forward-thinking alumni implementing innovative methods to preserve unique historic resources and address preservation challenges. This event would not have been possible without the support of HPPA members, as well as the guidance, expertise, and encouragement we received from our advisor, Professor Michael Tomlin. I'd also like to recognize the hard work and dedication of the other members of the Symposium Planning Committee, including Myra Hadigi, HPP class of 2012, Melanie Coulter-Medrano, HPP class of 2017, and current students Zoe Merod and Angela Fernandez. Our lineup this morning consists of Zoe Merod, HPP class of 2022, who will be presenting on Elmira's Dunn Field, followed by Michael LaFlash, HPP class of 2019, who will speak on promoting diversity in historic tax credit projects. After Michael, current student Jeff Giovanoni will present on Ithaca's Firebrand Books Building, New York's first LGBTQ landmark. Finally, for our last presentation this morning, current PSSO members Jeff Giovanoni, Angela Fernandez, and Tejal Shaltria will provide a recap on the 2022 work weekend in Buffalo. Our first speaker, Zoe, was born and raised in Ithaca, New York. She graduated from Ithaca High School and attended Ithaca College, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Art History with a minor in Medieval and Renaissance Studies in December of 2019. After that, she remained in Ithaca to pursue her graduate studies at Cornell. She's an avid sports fan who grew up watching Cornell hockey games from Section H in Liner Rink with her family, listening to her dad tell stories about the '86 Celtics at the old Boston Garden, and following her brother play baseball up and down the East Coast. Zoe's presentation, titled America's Pastime in New York's Southern Tier, the Physical and Cultural Legacies of Elmira's Dunn Field, examines one municipal baseball stadium as it contributed to the wealth and collective memory of the city of Elmira. The site where Dunn Field is located today has been used for sporting events, primarily organized baseball, for more than a century. The story of the site and the stadium reveals a ritualized land use pattern, particularly with regard to America's pastime. Dunn Field is a case study for understanding the broader development of baseball in the United States and the trajectory of stadium design, while also reflecting the intricacies of place-based community making surrounding baseball in small-town America. Zoe's presentation will conclude with a pitch for the stadium's inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places, showing how it could potentially be listed, highlighting its important place in baseball history. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zoe to begin her presentation.
All right, so thanks again, Michelle. I'm really excited to be here this weekend with everybody for our second HPPA symposium. I had the chance to be a part of our inaugural symposium last year, so I'm really thrilled to be back again. And I want to begin today with a couple anecdotal stories, which will help provide some background on this presentation and explain how I landed on this one as my thesis topic. So for those of you who attended the symposium last year, you might remember that I presented with one of my peers and we discussed our work and research on the former slave and abolitionist John W. Jones, whose residence in Elmira is today a museum dedicated to his legacy. That project was really formative to my preservation education, being introduced to the world of John Jones and historic Elmira. And as the project progressed throughout the school year, I made many trips to Elmira to visit the archives and the John Jones House Museum. And I became more and more familiar with the city and its historic resources. But it was even some more months before that, while I was working still on my undergrad at Ithaca College in my final semester, that I had found Mike LaFlash's thesis. He's here today as well, which is a nice connection. His thesis told the story of the demolition of the Boston Garden, one of the most iconic stadiums in the United States. And particularly for Boston sports fans like Mike and myself, it's really a mecca for sports history, where players like Bobby Orr and Larry Bird etched our city's name into the halls of fame. And as an undergraduate student studying the history of architecture and being an avid sports fan, it was really exciting to see scholarship like this that was devoted to the biography of sports stadiums. So I wanted to do that too. So when it came time to choose a thesis topic, Dunfield seemed like the perfect opportunity, as I had become familiar with Elmira through my previous work, and I had spent time in the bleachers of Dunfield as well, the last anecdote being that my brother played for the Elmira Pioneers at Dunfield during the 2021 season. So it all kind of came together. And the current iteration of the Pioneers are today a team of off-season college baseball players from Division 1, 2, and 3, who compete in the Perfect Game Collegiate Baseball League, a league that was founded as a development league for the majors. So I'm starting here with the most recent version of the Pioneers and their stadium so that you can get a sense of what exists today. And I think that that will really enrich the presentation as we move backwards in time. So of course, to understand any place, we must begin with the maps. If Professor Tomlin has taught any of us anything, it's that we start with the maps. So here is the 1876 Atlas of Elmira. And on this map, north is to the left here. And so Dunfield is down in the southeastern corner of the city, sitting on a bend in the Chemung River. And as you can see at the time, this land was vacant here south of Luce Street. And then by 1896, we can see that this land where Dunfield is became the Interstate Fairgrounds. And then I love this 1901 bird's eye because it gives great little details showing how the Interstate Fairgrounds were designed and used. Of course, the large oval racetrack is front and center, which was used for bicycle and horse racing during these fairs. The 19th century obviously was a world of fairs, and the development of Elmira's own localized fairground fits into that history. Originally set up as an exhibition for agriculturalists to show new farming techniques and technology, the local fair was born and evolved into a distinct American cultural experience centering around these sort of entertainment grounds. Eventually, baseball and football were to be played at the oval racetrack rather than just the original horses and bicycles, and thus the Maple Avenue Driving Park, a space for year-round sports, was established. So the driving park provided a place for local football and baseball clubs to play, and they began to obviously attract visitors. And as was typical and true of baseball's origins, baseball in Elmira was played by local clubs and groups of friends. Local companies and societies sponsored their own teams, and many teams grew in popularity as onlookers became more regular fans. And one of these amateur organizations was the Father Matthew Temperance Society. By 1903, baseball was a regular part of the newspapers in Elmira, with reports noting the high caliber of play that came out of the Father Matthew Temperance games, and even comparing their scores and stats to those of the big leagues. And in this image, you can see that the squad was made up of local college players and amateurs, and it wasn't uncommon for Cornell ball players to play for the Father Matthew team, as you can see here as well. So the men who made up the Father Matthew Temperance Society in Elmira were lawyers, doctors, dentists, and businessmen who were prominent members of the Elmira Roman Catholic community, and particularly that which surrounded the Saints Peter and Paul Church at 161 High Street, which was the oldest congregation in Elmira dating back to the 1840s. Saints Peter and Paul churchgoers were the same men who were part of the Father Matthew Society, and thus the same men who suited up for the Father Matthew baseball team. One of the men that I discovered in my research was Frank Disney, a well-known Elmira lawyer who served as the society's financial secretary. Disney spent the latter half of his legal career as the Assistant State Attorney General, where he lived in Albany until his death in 1933. His obituary also mentioned his membership in the Elmira Knights of Columbus, obviously another Catholic fraternal organization, similar to the Father Matthew Temperance Society. And this wasn't uncommon, as many men who were members of both organizations were also buried in the Saints Peter and Paul Cemetery, again, cementing this connection between church and baseball activities. And at the time, the Father Matthew boys were really the kings of the Maple Avenue driving park. And as the fate of Elmira's professional team between 1885 and 1900 was uncertain year to year, the Father Matthew team provided a consistency for baseball fans. In fact, as Elmira couldn't keep a bid in the professional circuit during the 1903 season, it was the Father Matthew team that actually hosted the New York Giants of the National League for an exhibition game at the Maple Avenue Diamond. The Giants that year were managed by John Muggsy McGraw, who was once a paperboy himself for the trains that ran through Elmira. He learned the game of baseball in Elmira by attending games, carrying bats and shagging fly balls for the local squad as a kid. And his return was the talk of the whole city. It was really a homecoming of sorts. So on McGraw's Giants roster was Christy Mathewson, long held to be one of the greatest pitchers in the game. And his name is still popping up in conversation today. So he also came to Elmira that year. Let's see. All right. So when the Giants arrived in Elmira, they stayed at the Hotel Langwell, which itself has a particularly interesting history in connection with sports in Elmira. First opened in 1896, the Langwell was described as strictly first class and even hosted FDR during his stay in Elmira on his campaign trail for governor in 1928. That was the same year that it also hosted Babe Ruth during his exhibition tour in 1928, which I'll highlight in a few minutes. The Langwell also seemed to be the unofficial forum for baseball meetings in Elmira during the multiple years of uncertainty in securing a team to play for the city. And what I want to highlight here is that although it has long been demolished, the Hotel Langwell proves to be an important part of the story of baseball in Elmira, a place connected to the history of the game that was at one point so prominently interwoven with daily life in Elmira. So while my thesis was primarily concerned with the stadium as the physical manifestation of baseball in this city, other places in the urban environment must also be considered when compiling such a history, and the Langwell is a good example of that. Sports do not exist in a vacuum. Players are human, and humans must be clothed, fed, and sheltered and transported. So I hope that my presentation today will make it apparent that the characteristics of the city of Elmira help to cultivate a flourishing baseball scene. Although the Father Matthew baseball team hosted talent as good as it gets, it was still an amateur team. This meant that the team's travel, equipment, and general expenses were funded by donation dollars from their annual baseball fair. The fairs were held for many years in the early 20th century, and major items like Francis Bacon pianos, diamond-studded cuffs, and parlor lamps were auctioned off. This examination of the personnel and funding capabilities behind the Father Matthew baseball team shows that this was a club attracting a certain level of social status. While amateur in nature, these men were by no means rough and tumble. They were men with day jobs in the industries that brought wealth to the city and who nightlighted as baseball players for the love of the game and interest in banding together with other temperance like-minded individuals. The Maple Avenue driving park then takes on a clear connotation with a wealth and class status, as sources show little to no evidence of minority communities using the park for recreational activities unless they were invited. So Maple Avenue driving park was home to a specific kind of baseball, one that was governed along social and racial lines. Of course, when we're talking about sports history in Elmira, the importance of Eldridge Park cannot be overlooked. So farther up north, on the Chemung River is Eldridge Park, and at its peak, it was Elmira's own Central Park, a grand Victorian one that incorporated picturesque landscapes and recreational spaces. An all-Black baseball team named the Casinos after the Eldridge Park Casino, a three-story building that offered panoramic views of the lake from its balconies, played almost exclusively at the Eldridge driving park, playing against other teams composed of men of color, like the Keystones of Ithaca and the Southport Stars. Aside from lending its name for the team's moniker, the casino also was a place for cultural gathering in the late 19th century for the Black community in Elmira. Back at the Maple Avenue Diamond, America's first African-American professional baseball team, the Cuban Giants, took on the Father Matthew Nine in June of 1902, just a year before they went on to win the Colored World Championship in 1903. The Cuban Giants predate the establishment of the Negro League, making their professional contracts immensely important in the history of baseball. Some 45 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, the fact that an all-Black team like the Cuban Giants, that they even visited Elmira to play a white team, is really remarkable. American society in 1902 was segregated, obviously, across all facets of life. So this blurring of the segregation lines happening in Elmira at the time is fascinating, and one point that really I want to emphasize here, and then really should be pursued further in the future. By 1910, it was clear that league baseball in Elmira could not be successfully played at the Maple Avenue Driving Park, both from the players and the fans' perspective. The park was built for racing, not for baseball, and this was a concern for the owner of the professional Elmira Colonels team at the time, Frank Brees. And so a new park was built specifically for baseball in 1910 next to the Maple Avenue Park, just south of the city line. This wooden park was essentially the same orientation and shape of the field that we see today on site. And in that way, it can be said that the field in use today has structural origins from the first decade of the 20th century. Frank Brees not only brought professional baseball back to Elmira, but he also built this new park. And it was Brees who sent a committee to Jersey City to see the field there on which the Jersey City Skeeters played. West Side Park, or Skeeters Field as it was more commonly known, was a classic early ballpark in design with a single deck grandstand surrounding home plate with seating down the first and third baselines. So the new stadium was named Recreation Park at the suggestion of a local resident who won the naming contest that was put on by the local newspaper. The Colonels won the State League Championship in 1914, drawing large crowds to the new ballpark and really validating the need for a stadium especially designed and dedicated to baseball in Elmira. So it was around the same time too, into the 1920s, that the minor league baseball farm system was growing into a system in which minor league teams became affiliated with major league teams, and those major league teams used the minors as a way to develop players through the ranks. The next vital part of the story of baseball in Elmira is the establishment of the Arctic League, which is a charity that's still alive and well in the community today. The story goes that a group of men would get together each week during the spring and summer at a field near the Happy Thought Cottage on the opposite side of town and up the river from Dunn Field. In a field behind the cottage, the men would play, and the attorney, Frank Disney, was the lead umpire for these pickup games. The men named their pickup games the Arctic League because of their persistence to play even in the harshest of weather. After each game, the men would gather in Harry Laganegro's cigar shop on Lake Street, and one cold night, a young boy with threadbare clothes apparently came to the door asking to get warm, and the men took him in, and the rest is sort of mythological history. So since it was so close to Christmas, the tradition became one that was tied to the season of charity, and an institution was born in Elmira that still exists today. The second president of the league was Edward Dunn, the man, of course, who would go on to give his name to the field that we know today. Dunn was born in Elmira in 1866, and he graduated from Elmira Free Academy. In 1886, he began working as a bookkeeper at the Chemung Canal Bank, and in 1919, assumed the position of president at the newly reorganized Chemung Canal Trust Company. Dunn was a Knight of Columbus, a trustee of the Chemung County Historical Society, and was obviously the second president of the Arctic League, to name just a few of his cultural and philanthropic contributions to the city. Dunn's connections within Elmira reached into each corner of the city, and at the time of his death in 1929, Dunn was thought to be Elmira's foremost citizen. In 1920, Dunn stepped in to save the future of baseball in Elmira, and as a member of the Knights of Columbus, the Arctic League, and the Elks Club, Dunn ran in the same circles as those who were associated with organized baseball in the city. So in 1920, he purchased a recreation park from the Southern Tier Baseball Association with the intent to house the Arctic League team permanently and ensure that Elmirans had a place to watch and play baseball for years to come. The Arctic Leaguers met to officially change the name of the park to Dunn Field to honor the man who donated it for the recreational enjoyment of all Elmirans. And the field was kept by the Dunn Field Corporation until 1938, when the records show that the field was officially deeded to the city of Elmira. In 1928, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig brought their exhibition squads to Elmira to take on the Elmira Colonels during their barnstorming tour of upstate New York. Babe hit a 500-foot shot that allegedly went through the roof of somebody's house on Phoenix Avenue and landed in their bedroom. The grandstand was deteriorating by 1935, and the Dunfield Corporation saw a funding opportunity from the Public Works Administration, which had recently funded the construction of a new modern grandstand in Syracuse. The government grant was only possible if the stadium was first turned over to the city. So the project proposal for the new stadium was successful, and the PWA grant agreed to grant $44,000 towards the new stadium project. The new Dunfield Stadium was built with concrete and steel and opened in 1939. Between 1962 and 1981, the Elmira Pioneers were part of the Baltimore Orioles and Boston Red Sox farm systems, in which can be arguably called the golden eras of baseball in Elmira. The Pioneers won the Eastern League Championship in 1964 under the leadership of Earl Weaver. And during the 65 season, Eddie Watt threw 2 no-hitters, and a young Lou Piniella hit 3 home runs in a single game. Before the end of the decade, the Pioneers won another Eastern League Championship in 66 and made a deep playoff run for another, falling just short in 68. The 1966 championship came under the leadership of Darryl Johnson, who would go on to become one of the Boston Red Sox most storied managers from 74 to 76, winning Manager of the Year in 75. Johnson, of course, managed that 75 Red Sox team, that was another arguable franchise best team made up of greats like Carl Yastrzemski, Carlton Fisk, and Jim Bryce. For the 1968 season, the Pioneers welcomed a new head coach, Cal Ripken Sr., who had a prosperous career as a catcher in the Orioles farm system, going on to manage the Orioles later in his career. As a product of the minor league system himself, Ripken Sr. had an eye for the game as a manager and brought that talent to Elmira for the 68 season. Although the Pios celebrated a league championship in 1976, the increasing operating cost of Dunn Field loomed in the minds of the Elmira City Council, and the future of the stadium was uncertain. By the end of 78, one thing was for certain, that Dunn Field's concrete was falling apart. With community volunteers, labor, and the county's CETA workforce, over 200,000 or 652,000 in 2022 was invested into Dunfield's modernization and repairs. However, in 1980, the city's budget crisis put Dunfield on the chopping block once again, and the 1981 city budget projected operating costs of the field to be $50,000 with an income of only $22,000. Luckily, Elmira City Council voted to keep Dunfield open, as members of the Dunfield Advisory Committee vowed to provide volunteer labor to maintain the field. By 1983, taxpayers, city officials, and baseball enthusiasts alike could see the innate value of Dunfield more clearly than ever before. Even though the loose concrete, broken seats, and patchy playing field, the value of the stadium as historic as Dunn could be understood with one look at previous Eastern League cities and their stadiums. Places like Binghamton, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and Trenton were among cities that once hosted an Eastern League team like Elmira did, all with longstanding minor league baseball traditions, but the only difference was their stadiums didn't exist. In 1983, Dunfield was still standing while the others had not been so lucky to avoid demolition. So Dunfield's worth within the community was obvious in that it was kept alive by the efforts of the community who valued its presence enough to fight for it. After 1996, the Pioneers were no longer major league affiliates, instead joining various independent leagues. During the height of the 2004 season, the sports editor for the Star-Gazette newspaper wrote a scathing critique of the field, with specific note of the scoreboard. The editor likened the shoddy scoreboard to the overall morale of the team and the state of Dunfield as a whole. Dunfield was still a monument to baseball in Elmira, but obviously it was being allotted less and less resources as time went on. In 2005, the Elmira Pioneers joined the New York Collegiate Baseball League, a summer woodbat league that was founded in '78 as a collegiate development league for Major League Baseball. With this move, the composition of the Pioneers changed once more, becoming a team composed of mainly college baseball players who had not yet been signed to a professional contract. By 2010, the Pioneers had become one of the founding 8 teams in the Perfect Game Collegiate Baseball League, the league that's in existence today. While some may see this move away from Major League affiliation as a step down, knowledge of the history of baseball played on the site of Dunn Field shows that today's team is somewhat akin to the earliest high-level amateur teams like the Father Matthew Temperance Society team, who played on the Maple Avenue Driving Park Diamond. Additionally, many of the original 8 teams in the PG CBL were once New York Penn League teams, which illustrates the new league's use of existing baseball infrastructure in upstate New York and a continuation of its legacy. One major impact of sports and their stadiums on cities and their communities is the generation of civic pride, which I think is itself a benefit to be considered alongside the economic. Intangible social benefits surrounding sports events in stadiums have high value when it comes to overall quality of life in the city. This virtue really can't be ignored, and in Elmira, there's definitely a sense of pride among the community that centers around Dunn Field, albeit perhaps less intense than it was years ago during the eras of professional baseball. It's still this reverence for the baseball history of their city that's shared intergenerationally among locals, and thus baseball continues to be played on the site where it has been played for more than 100 years. The future of baseball in Elmira is bright because its past is so rich. And to conclude today, I want to think about that future just briefly. Although the stadium that stands today at Dunn Field is not the oldest park in America, that title goes to Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama, which was constructed in 1910. There is much that can be learned from Rickwood's restoration and revitalization. Rickwood's field was documented by the Historic American Buildings Survey and nominated to the National Register in 1993 for its place in baseball history, its role in the fabric of the community, its architectural significance, and its potential to create change within the present community. Using these reasons as a guide for Dunn Field's further preservation, the potential to nominate Dunn Field to the National Register doesn't seem so far-fetched. If Dunn Field were to be recognized on the New York State Register, this status would connect it to a larger network of historic stadiums and ballparks throughout the state. And what if there was a network linking all the historic ballparks in the state, organized respectively by major and minor league affiliation, with a passport to be stamped at each location for tourists to complete? This could be similar to what the National Park Service already has in use today, but it could be applied nicely, I think, to the context of historic baseball stadiums. New York especially has resources centered around Cooperstown and could inspire the more than 300,000 visitors each year to the National Baseball Hall of Fame to continue their baseball pilgrimage journeys throughout the state. And all of this research into the historic landscapes of baseball in America is not distant and only for history nerds like me. In fact, there's a real connection to be made between Major League Baseball's recent lockout that happened over the course of 99 days, ending earlier this year, and the work that I'm doing here. So one of the fundamental issues cited by the Players Union, which prompted the lockout, was the MLB's dismantling of the minor leagues and subsequent maltreatment of the system's most vulnerable players. The minor league is a workforce not unlike any other, and the MLB essentially made budget cuts by shrinking the number of teams that it supports. This reshaping of the minor league farm system has had tremendous effects on the landscapes of the cities that have hosted these teams, in many cases for over 100 years. Marty Chalk, the Pioneer's longtime public address announcer, summarized it best when he said, quote, "The best way to kill Major League Baseball is to kill minor league baseball." And I'd say that goes for the ballparks that house these institutions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. That was a really excellent presentation. I think many of us from recent graduating classes have had some sort of interaction with Elmira through various courses. It was great to learn a little bit more about this piece of Elmira history. Let's see if anybody in the audience has any questions. Jessica says neighboring Bowman Field in Williamsport, Pennsylvania is also a historic ballpark.
Yeah, that's great. I definitely wanted to do some more digging into the Little League system in Williamsport. I know they have a really big baseball history down there as well. It's definitely interesting just in our southern tier area here that there's Binghamton, Syracuse, and a ton of these fields and sites that I think have histories as long as I've just shown with Dunn Field. So there's theses to be done each one.
It's HPPA virtual
conference. You're still on the.
Since I'm the co-host, I have the mute power here, so I just muted that.
Jack, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Yeah, as an architect, I guess I'm just fascinated with looking at just from the entrance, the portal there, just fascinated by the way stadiums combine a facade that, at least from the early steel frame buildings, the masonry facade was always a cladding and something that would conceal the frame, but then peeking out from the sides and of course underneath, from beneath, you have this sort of, what you might say, a celebration of the exposed steel framing and the cross bracing and so on, tie rods. So this is an interesting combination. And of course, and I found from work I had done in the past, actually on a Boyle Stadium, which was a Stamford, Connecticut high school stadium, which combined kind of traditional stonemasonry WPA project with concrete bleachers. And so the physical issues that you have, the interface between the load-bearing masonry and then the bleachers that were supposed to be spanning across, and the separation and all. So it raises challenges too from materials conservation, but just from the design, the juxtaposition is fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I was really fascinated with the sort of triumphal arch entrance that they have going on there, and it's very classic in sort of the language, but it also, I think, looks very mid-century modern. It was looking forward, I think, in some ways.
Did you mention who the architect was?
The architects were Haskell and Partners, so they were just a local Elmira firm. I didn't look too far into their work, but that's definitely an avenue to go down.
Joseph, you had a question.
Great presentation. I should start by saying I was raised by a loyal New York Yankees fan and saw my first Major League Baseball game at the old Yankee Stadium before they decided to update it in the 1970s, and now it's no longer even there. I happen to live about a mile from Reading Phillies Stadium. The Reading Phillies are a AA affiliate of the Philadelphia Phillies. The stadium was built in the 1950s. There have been some renovations and additions, but its basic character is still intact. And one of the things I love about minor league baseball, actually there are a number of things I love about minor league baseball, and you've pretty much hit on all of them. They're a great rallying cry for the community. It's something all the community really loves and gets behind. Mm-hmm. It's affordable. You can take your family without getting a second mortgage on your house. It's approachable. You are close up to the players. And sometimes if a major league player is rehabbing, you have a chance to see this player rehabbing with the minor league team. I can think of several from the Philadelphia Phillies who we saw when they were rehabbing. And I can think of one in particular, Ryan Howard, when he was with the minor league team, and you're sitting there watching him play, and you know it's just a matter of time before he's called up to the majors. But there's just something so tremendous about minor league, and I was saddened to hear that. I did not realize that that was one of the issues in the recent major league contract dispute, because the minor leagues are a great feeder to major league teams. And I think it just develops an interest in baseball, especially for young children who are having their first baseball experience at a minor league team. So I love the way you brought so much into this, the history of Elmira, the history of baseball. Great job. Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great comments. I agree. I also spent a lot of time at Binghamton Mets games, so that's where I got my sort of first. We didn't go to many Pios games when I was a kid, but Binghamton Mets I remember was a real big thing, and we got to see a lot of the Mets players who were rehabbing come through, and it's such a family-oriented sort of entertainment venue they have going on there. So.
You're correct about family, because I started taking my kids when they were about 5 and 4, and now I've taken grandchildren at the same age. And it's just a great way to spend time, and a great way to introduce children to sports, and a great way to get them to experience history, even though they may not realize they're experiencing history.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Are there any other questions before we head off to a short break? Michael.
Zoe, about the Catholic Sports Connection. You mentioned the Knights of Columbus and the Temperance Society. Is there any way in which we might explore how the diocese regard the sports events, particularly baseball?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking, I did a little bit of reading with just the temperance movement itself. Obviously, the tenets of temperance is, abstinence from alcohol and physical activity. So I think in general, any sport, physical exercise is sort of part of that religious piety in a way. But I definitely could look further into the diocese themselves and see if they had any writings from the Temperance Society in Elmira specifically.
I'm wondering, in light of the later discussion we'll have with Bob Yeager, whether he has any connections or knowledge of what faith-based activities that are taking place. I'm recalling last year's presentation, you remember, which included Jennifer Baskerville-Burroughs in the Episcopalian realm, as she is a bishop. But I'm thinking we need to know a little bit more about the Catholics in traditional Irish contexts. It might be possible to explore that more programmatically.
Yeah, that would be great. I didn't think of the connection with Bob, so it's great to have him later this weekend.
Good. Thank you. Great job. I would look forward to seeing you make the presentation in Elmira, just because I want to see the Elmirans' reactions.
All right. I think we're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then we're going to hop back on at the top of the hour for Michael Flash's presentation.